This takes us back a little bit. This takes us back a little bit. I told you before we would do an exercise around laws and kind of the construction of the legal system. What I want you to think about here, without going too much into the unnecessary background or detail, is social construction of race, right? How these racial categories got constructed, the categories that we now have to deal with, say in Reconstruction or with lynching or these other topics, get constructed over time. Right? They're constructed by the society, and in some respects, they're constructed by the legal system. Right? They're constructed in the legal system. So think about the social construction of racial categories, categories of gender and class too, as we'll see. Think about the role of the law, the role of economics. Think about our concepts of imagined community and tipping point, how they might help us understand some of these. I'm not going to read through all these, but I'm going to point out some things here. Now, usually I usually use this discussion in the first part of African American history because it deals with colonial Virginia. Some of you that should know that colonial Virginia is the first colony. It's the first permanent English settlement that gets set up and established. So in some ways, it's kind of a model for all the rest of the colonies that get developed. Right? In many ways, it serves as a model. 1607, Virginia is founded as a colony. 12 years later, 20 African Americans get dropped off in Virginia. So it really, in some ways, is a good starting point for discussing both American history and African American history in some interesting ways. So again, think about imagined community and tipping point. Think about how those concepts may help us understand this. A lot of what you need to understand Virginia is to know what's happening in Europe, the reasons why folks come to Virginia, the reason why the British are, first of all, finally able to come here is based on a lot of European history. But the reason why they come initially is to make money. Virginia is set up as a colony to make a profit, first and foremost. So that was the goal. A handful of folks pool their money together and start a colony. They want to get rich, kind of like the Spanish had done in terms of developing colonies in the New World. Britain finally breaks through and has their chance to do that. And Virginia, they think, is going to be that. They think folks are going to come to Virginia and find gold in the streets. Right? The Spanish had sent back all these stories and wealth from their colonies, and Britain says, let's do the same thing. Right? Based on all the stories, we'll just find gold laying in the streets. Doesn't happen. Right? They come to Virginia and there's no gold laying in the streets. But eventually they're going to find something to make a profit on. They're going to find something that does make the colony profitable after some time. It takes some time for that to happen. Initially, it does not look like Virginia's going to work out. It does not look good for Virginia. Like I said, Jamestown, Virginia is founded in 1607. By 1609, folks are starving to death, literally starving to death. They called it the starving time, in fact. The winter from 1609 to 1610, you go from, I think, 500 colonists to 60 colonists, folks just falling out dead. They're writing stories back about people eating rats, people eating each other. It really happened in this period. It was really kind of rough, and so folks are thinking, this is not going to work. But they do survive. They do survive, especially getting help from Native Americans and whatnot, and they're going to survive. More people are going to come. Part of what develops in that first difficult time, though, is the idea that you need discipline. You need some sort of harsh discipline in this colony of Virginia if it's going to survive. Now, remember, you had a bunch of folks coming here wanting to make money. Now, when folks want to make quick money, they don't normally think about long-term issues. Right? So you had a bunch of young men get off these boats, because women aren't initially here. They get off the boats and they start looking for gold. They start mining and doing all these things. They didn't build houses right away. They didn't plant crops right away. It's part of the reason why they were starving. Are they going to get rich quick and go home? That was initially their plan. So discipline is a problem. You had, so you may remember some of these names. Captain John Smith, military captain, imposes some discipline, puts all these rules in place, really harsh rules. This is mostly background, so don't worry if you don't get it all. This is going to set up our discussion using this handout. The death penalty was applied for various things. He's trying to establish discipline, so keep in mind this idea of discipline. Something very important happens, though, in 1614, early tipping point of sorts in 1614. What happens is they find their gold. They find their gold, not literally, but they find something that's going to make them some money. Tobacco. Tobacco is the gold. Tobacco is this big hit. It's a drug, right? So folks are getting high, essentially. Back in Europe, it's all the rage, and they find a way to grow tobacco here in Virginia. They found a version of it from the Caribbean, Trinidad in particular. A guy named John Wolfe is credited with finding a form of tobacco that will grow here, and it's an explosion. It's an explosion. So tobacco as a cash crop is going to change the fortune of Virginia. You can think about economics as we examine these laws really quickly here. John Rolfe began experimenting with it. The first real cargoes get sold back by 1617, so about 10 years after the colony is founded. So everything is good, but there are three problems with tobacco that are going to be significant. At least three problems with tobacco. One, it leads to a lack of diversification. People only wanted to plant tobacco. So if you have a choice between planting corn and feeding yourself, or planting tobacco and get rich, irresponsible folks are going to plant only tobacco, and that's what happens. Right? It actually starts a process of relying on one crop in the South. First it's going to be tobacco, later it's going to be cotton, right? Where the South becomes too reliant on one thing. So don't put all your eggs in one basket is kind of the phrase around that. Soil exhaustion. Soil exhaustion. Tobacco wears out the land. It wears out the soil. So for example, if you plant tobacco, if this room was our farm, if we plant tobacco in this room 3 years in a row, three seasons in a row, nothing else will grow in here for about 10 years. Especially before they realize about fertilizers and things, it will wear out the soil for 10 years. So what happens then? If we're, say this is our nation, we plant tobacco, we make pretty good money these first 3 years, but demand is growing. We want to plant more and more. What happens when we can't plant? We're making money. What are we going to do? Say, oh, well, we're out of land. What do you think we're going to do? You know, go next door. 211, I think they got some land over there. They're not using it right. We're bigger than them. Let's go get this land. We better get that land up, right? They'll take their corner. That's what starts to happen. Now, this society is surrounded by Native Americans, right? So you get more and more encroachments on people's lands. It leads to conflict between these colonists and Native Americans. So that's going to be a problem. It's going to lead to violence, conflict of various types. It's also, the third problem is it's labor intensive. This is hard work. Tobacco requires attention 9 months out of the year, right? Long hours. It might be harvest time. You might be out there 12 hours. This is hard work. A lot of these folks didn't want to do this hard work. They just want to get rich, right? So these are three problems that tobacco sort of puts out there already. Right? Some of this we won't necessarily need. But what happens again, think about this use of land. Think about the motivations for sending more and more colonists over. You start getting more and more British colonists coming over. The headright system, if you ever see this phrase, what the headright system basically said was that if you could pay your own way from Europe to Virginia, if you had enough money for a ticket, you'd be given 50 acres of land. Sounds like a good deal, right? Good point. There was no title to it, but essentially it's Native American land, right? So you get 50 acres. If you can pay your own way, you get 50 acres. Plus, if you could pay someone else's way, you get an additional 50 acres for each person you paid for. So say you're a middle class to wealthy person in Britain. You want to bring you, your wife, and 2 children. You got enough money for the tickets. Get on the ship. How many acres would you get? You, your wife, 2 children. 200 acres, right? Get a nice little farm. You can get started, right? You get some wealthy folks who are like, oh, that's cool. This is a great way to make some money, right? Now, there are not that many of them, But there are some that was a lot of money, so they could gobble up huge pieces of land, the best land. But most whites are not going to come over this way. About 75% or so of whites that immigrate here don't have money for the ticket. Don't have money for the ticket. They are going to be indentured servants. They're going to be indentured servants. Anybody know what an indentured servant is, or what indentured servitude is? Have you heard that phrase before?
I would think that it's like a servant or something.
Yeah, you can definitely guess by looking at the phrase in some respects. It's going to be about servitude or working for somebody, right? But that phrase indenture might be the one that's more complicated. In essence, you're a temporary kind of servant.
You get paid.
You don't get paid.
You don't get paid.
What you would do is indenture yourself or sign an indenture contract, they call it. So you say, okay, look, I don't got money for the ticket, but I want to go to Virginia. Maybe you were homeless in England. Maybe you were poor. Maybe you were landless in London. You know, the streets of London are overcrowded. If you're a farmer, you don't have any land, you're in trouble, right? We talked about that with Reconstruction. So a lot of folks are like, let's give it a try. Let's see this Virginia thing. I don't have anything to lose. I don't have money for the ticket. Get somebody wealthy, say, hey, pay my way. I'll sign this indenture contract. I'll work for you. Typically, an indentured servitude contract was signed for a period of 4 to 7 years. You would work for someone else. 4 to 7 years. After that 4 to 7 years, you're free. You get a piece of land, some tools, maybe a little cabin, get set up. So some are like, hey, roll the dice. I'm homeless in London. I just go work for you for 7 years and then I'm good. I'm a free land farmer. Oh, let's go. Early on, Virginia, this is a gamble. Early on, the death rates are so high, a lot of folks aren't living through their indentures. Right? Disease and such, conflict with natives, harsh winters. But later on, this has turned into a good deal. Indentured servants can be, you have indentured servants of multiple races, as we're going to see here. There are white indentured servants, we're going to see African indentured servants, Native Americans. But that's what indentured servitude is. Now, early on, gender is as important as race in this time. It's males coming over. Males are coming over because they're seen as the best workers initially, right? That's the perception of gender, at least. But what happens if you have a colony with a whole bunch of young men with no women around? Let me rephrase that. What happens at the club on Friday night when it's all dudes? Too much testosterone. And what happens? Violence. Stepped on my shoes. Guys, especially young, unattached guys, conflict, violence. This is exactly what's going on in early Virginia. Yes, ma'am.
Why would the natives be indentured servants if they're already there?
Why would they? They wouldn't choose to. That comes out of the conflict and the warfare, essentially. It's a good question. Especially the Native American population is not just one group. Right? There are thousands of cultural groups that are there. And sometimes they're fighting among themselves. So say you're fighting amongst yourself, you might get sold into essentially slavery. But yeah, they wouldn't choose to do it. Not at all. As the English colony grows and becomes stronger, then they're able to sort of take over more and more, and it kind of leads to that. It's a good question. Turn yourself off. Why did you do that? Okay. Lost my page. Okay, so said 1617, they're sending crops of tobacco back. 1619 is a hugely important year. Very important year for our purposes. 3 things happen in 1619 for the first time. It's a tipping point, as you see here. First, 1619, the Virginia Company, the British company that establishes Virginia, starts sending over women. Right? You got to do something about all this testosterone. Right? If you want to have a long-term stable society, you can't have just men there. These ladies want wives, these guys want wives, these sorts of things. They start transporting women over. And women are going to be indentured servants too, working tobacco fields just like men, especially working class women. So that's one thing, women get sent over. Second thing that's important was they called the founding of what's the House of Burgesses, they called it. Really the first local government in Virginia. So women get sent over and you get the first kind of local government. Why is that important for American history? Well, some say this is the first step towards 150 years later, revolution. Right? Folks have government here. They start making small decisions for themselves. Right? Eventually, they're going to say, why do we need a king? Right? We can make our own decisions. It's going to take some time to get there. So women, local government. The third thing is most important for us, for this class. 20 Africans are dropped off in Jamestown. 20 Africans are dropped off in Jamestown. What basically happens is the Dutch ship that was having trouble on the seas, it needs to trade something for water and supplies. They drop off 20 African slaves that they had. Now there's some debate as to whether these first 20 Africans that get dropped in Jamestown were slaves or servants. We're going to go through how we can take a look at that process here, looking at the laws. Some say, look, there wasn't a system of slavery yet because there wasn't all these black people. So it takes some time for that to develop. When does that actually happen? What's the tipping point in terms of racial slavery? We'll see here in a second as we look at this really quickly. So think about that background. I know that was a lot, but I want you to think about those three things. When Africans get here, what are the motivations, especially the economic motivations around tobacco? Tobacco was like crack and AIDS. It's making big money. Folks are addicted to it, especially throughout Europe. King James initially in England was like, no, I'm going to ban it. This is an unholy thing, but it's making all this money. So eventually King James says, you know what, maybe we should legalize it and put a tax on it. That sound like anything? Today? Alcohol, right? Big money. And other things now too, right? Especially alcohol. But what bigger business is that? I watch an NFL game without seeing all kind of beer commercials, right? So think about the money involved, think about the motivations, and think about how this is going to help set up categories of race, class, and gender that we're going to have to deal with as late as Reconstruction. Slowly what happens is people decide that this indentured servitude thing isn't really working out. This indentured servitude thing isn't really working out for some of the reasons we'll look at. We need another system. First of all, there aren't enough Europeans coming over that want to be indentured servants. Over time, the economy in England improves. Folks don't want to come. Stories are getting back to England about how rough it is here. Indentured servants are writing letters like, hey, they beat us, we're not getting good food, they hardly have any clothes, don't come. Don't come. Indentured servants are causing various problems in the society, and we're going to see how imagined community and tipping point come here. So what we want to do is trace how do we go from a system of indentured servitude being the main labor system to a system of racial slavery. How do we go from indentured servitude to racial slavery? I would argue that we can see that happening in the law. You can see the development of categories of race, gender, and class. We're only going to have time to go through the race and gender stuff really quickly. I want to point out three or four important cases really quickly in the time that we have left. You guys are going to help me do this, especially you aspiring lawyers, criminal justice majors. This language may be a little difficult because this is kind of colonial Virginia Old English language, but pay attention to the increasing attempt to make servitude into racial slavery. You're going to start to separate servants based around race. Remember, there are black, white, native, indentured servants. So we can use imagined community, right, to understand that. And the development of racial slavery. The 1630 case is really, really interesting. The 1630 case, really, really interesting. A guy named Hugh Davis. Mr. Hugh Davis finds himself in some trouble. Now remember, there's an unequal gender ratio early on. I don't know if you saw that statistic, but men outnumber women 6-1 early on. Men outnumber women 6-1. And we know men are going to find, or white men, outnumber women 6-1. So they're going to find other partners. Right? There is mixing going on across the racial line early on. Right? Men are going to do what they do. People are going to do what they do. Mr. Hugh Davis, who's white, gets himself into some trouble. Let me get a volunteer to read this court case for me really quickly. 1630, remember, 23 years after the founding, about 13 years after tobacco starts getting sent, about 11 years after the first 20 Africans are dropped off. Go ahead.
Hugh Davis, who founded was supporting the Assembly of Negroes, and others for abusing himself to the honor of God and the shame of Christianity by defiling his body and lying with the Negroes, which fault he was to act. Next, Dr. Davis.
Okay, real quick, let's get a legal analysis then. What has Mr. Hugh Davis done that's so we know he's in trouble? What has he done? What's going to happen to him? What's his crime and what's his punishment?
Slept with a black person, and he's gonna get whipped in front of him.
Okay, slept with a black person, he's going to get whipped for it. Right? It's pretty clear. Again, the language is something there, but we can see exactly what's happening. He's going to get whipped in front of an audience. Right? So we know it's symbolically important. They're trying to teach not just him a lesson, but the entire group. Right? Watch this guy get whipped so you know not to do the same thing. Soundly whipped. It's not a joke. He's getting whipped before an assembly of Negroes and others. He's going to get whipped before a mixed audience. He's a white guy. Got to get whipped before Negroes. That in and of itself is kind of significant. Next Sabbath day. Defiling his body in line with the Negro. Now, they didn't say woman, but we can assume it was lying with a woman. Otherwise, it would have been a whole other set of issues in colonial Virginia. Right? It would have been an issue. All right. So, okay, that's pretty bad, right? 1630, he's going to get whipped. That's serious, right? Skip down to 1640. Skip down to 1640. Think about race and gender here. Mr. Sweat finds himself in a similar circumstance 10 years later. And what I want you to look at is his crime and punishment, and then we'll talk about if his punishment is better or worse, or harsher or worse, more or less harsh than Mr. Davis's. Sweat, 1640. The defendant, Robert Sweat, hath begotten with child a Negro woman servant belonging to Lieutenant Shepard. The court ruled that the said Negro woman shall be whipped at the whipping post, and the said Sweat shall tomorrow in the forenoon do public penance for his offense at James City. So public penance is he has to publicly apologize and kind of be ashamed, that kind of thing. James City Church in the time of divine service. Okay, so what has Mr. Sweat done? So is his crime less or is his crime worse than Hugh Davis or not? What do you think? In their eyes. Yeah. I mean, has what he done, is that seen as more serious or less serious? Seen as more serious, right? Because not only has he slept with her, but a child is going to be produced. Why is that, like you said, why is that a crime? What can we tell just by the language here? What can we infer? Why is it so what? He's having a kid. Who cares? Negro woman servant. He's having a child with someone else's property. Right? This is essentially a property violation. He's probably being charged by Lieutenant Shepard. Remember, you got your servant for 3 more years, say, on their contract, and now she's pregnant. Oh, she can't even work. Lieutenant Shepard's like, someone's got to pay me. Somebody got to pay me. Right? It's probably Lieutenant Shepard that's mad as well as the larger society because of the racial mixture. So it's economics and it's race happening here. So, okay, so his crime is worse. We agreed on that. What about his punishment? Does he get punished as much as Mr. Davis? No. What does he have to do? Yeah, say, I'm sorry. Oh, my bad. But what's different about, what else is different about this case than the first case? Taking it out on her. So 10 years later, she's going to get whipped, despite the fact she's pregnant. They don't even mention the woman in the first case. So 10 years later, we already see something happening in the law around race and around gender. Right? He's still getting, he has to apologize, so that's still kind of serious, a little shame. But if you got to apologize and get whipped, or just apologize, which one are you going to choose? I'll apologize all day if that's the choice. Right? If that's the choice. We'll come back to this because we're going to run out of time because some important things happen, very important things happen in the next case. We're about half class behind where I want to be, but make sure you're done with chapter 12 because we're going to move quickly back into that period. And then, we'll work through that stuff next week. Any questions about any of this? Okay.